One of my favorite writers is the essayist, novelist, short story poet, writer Wendell Berry. And Berry's novels and stories are all set in an imaginary small northeast Kentucky town called Port William. The people who populate Port William are subsistence farmers raising crops in the rich bottom land, along with sheep and cattle and chickens and a garden, whatever else they can to enable themselves to survive. And like every human community, Port William has its share of charlatans, cranks, and ne'er-do-wells. But they also have a profound sense of community, of what one character, a ne'er-do-well called Burley Coulter, calls the membership. They have a sense that they belong to each other, even those characters, cranks, and ne'er-do-wells. In the most moving story, one of his most moving stories, Watch With Me, Berry tells a story of a man by the name of Thacker Hempel, or Nightlife as he's called. He's not called Nightlife because he participates in the nightlife of Port William. There isn't any, but rather because his vision is so poor that he can't tell the difference between day and night. Nightlife also suffers from what Berry calls spells, times when he's kind of disconnected from himself. He's sad or he's angry or confused, maybe even dangerous, until he comes back to himself. On this one occasion, Nightlife decides that since there's a revival in town, that he's going to prepare the service and preach the sermon at the revival. So he picks out the hymns and the prayers and he works on the sermon. And he comes to the young pastor who's there with the revivalist, and Nightlife says, well, tonight I'm going to give the sermon. And understandably, if not wisely, the young preacher says that no, everything's already prepared and Nightlife cannot give the sermon that evening. And this sets Nightlife into one of his spells, and he leaves very angry at being rejected. And after wandering around for a while, he comes to a neighbor's farm. And the neighbor has been dealing with some pests, and he has his loaded shotgun, leaned up against his shed. Nightlife picks up the shotgun and walks off into the woods. Now, a man with a loaded shotgun that's not himself and can't see very well is a danger to himself and all of his neighbors. And so a few of the men start following him to protect him from himself and protect others from him. And this turns into a 2-day odyssey where they're wandering through the woods and farmsteads. People are coming out to provision them as they follow him, protecting him. Finally, Nightlife, after wandering all around, makes his way back to the very same farm where he had picked up the shotgun. And just as they get there, the whole group of men that's been following him are drenched in a rainstorm, a cloudburst. So they all crowd into the chicken coop to get out of the rain. And to their horror, Nightlife and the shotgun come in the chicken coop with them. Well, Nightlife decides that here's his congregation, and he's going to preach a sermon. And he tells them that there's a hymn, and they sing a hymn. And then he tells them what his text is. It's Jesus and the lost sheep. He preaches, "Oh, it's a dark place, my brethren. It's a dark place where the lost sheep tries to find its way and can't. The slopes are steep and the footing is hard. The ground is rough and stumbly and dark and overgrown with bushes and briars, a hilly and a hollery place. And the shepherd comes looking and a-calling for his lost sheep. And the sheep knows the shepherd's voice and he wants to go to it, but he can't find the path and he can't make it." Now, the men that are listening to this sermon know, of course, that Nightlife is talking about himself. They knew that, as Berry says, he was telling them what it was to be him, and they were moved. Long afterwards, many years later, when one of the men who were there is describing to a younger man, telling him this story, as people do in towns, they tell them over and over again. The young man asked him, "Did what he say make sense? Didn't you feel for him?" The older man said, "Of course I felt for him. That man could preach." Via the intervention of an old hen who was trying to get to her nest and flies up in Nightlife's face, all of a sudden he comes back to himself and he meekly hands over the shotgun. But those men knew that something holy and profound had just happened. In the gospel we just read, Jesus looks on the crowd rushing to catch up with his disciples, and he has compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Like the lost sheep in Jesus' story, like Nightlife, like the men who followed him, they were all vulnerable and needy, confused, fearful, and desperate because they had no shepherd. Like those men that had been walking through the valley of the shadow of death, they had been following a man who inadvertently could kill one of them or one of their neighbors or himself. And they had stumbled around for 2 days like lost sheep through fields and streams and woods, at times completely lost. Nightlife had not only taught them what it was to be him, he had taught them what it was like to feel like a lost sheep. These are days when many of us and many we know and love are like lost sheep. These are days when we might feel like sheep without a shepherd. The solid foundation of our institutional life seems to be shaken. We are told that our opponents now are not just opponents, but enemies. And we begin to think the unthinkable and fear for our future and for our children and grandchildren. And like lost sheep, we may have no idea how we got where we are now, and even less idea as to how to get back. Like Nightlife, we may hear the voice of the shepherd, but not know how to get to him. But we are the church of Jesus Christ, the good shepherd who laid down his life for the sheep. What do we have to offer to our scattered and divided and fearful world and country and communities? What do they need us to be now? The lost sheep of this world, I think, first needs us to be a community of hope and trust. The lost sheep of our world and communities and cities are surrounded by confusion and fear and desperation. And the last thing they need from us, the Church of Jesus Christ, is confusion and fear and desperation. To be a community of trust and hope is to be a people whose ultimate, deepest, and most profound trust is in the God who makes all things new in Jesus Christ. A community that does not think disaster is inevitable, does not think that hate is intractable, and does not think that confusion is unresolvable. No, this community of trust and hope loves both God and neighbor and is confident in God's love for them, every single one of them. It's a community that loves each other well. And you know that as hard as it is to love your enemy, sometimes it's even harder to love your friends. Secondly, God's church is to be a community of healing. Throughout the Gospel of Mark, we've seen Jesus busy at the task of healing. And this became one of the things that characterized the primitive church in its earliest years. During the 3rd and 4th century, there were plagues in the Greco-Roman world that ravaged the cities and could kill as many as a third of the population in a matter of days. When these plagues struck, those who were wealthy and able would flee, even the physicians. the Christians became known for staying and serving the poor and the sick. They were simply doing what Jesus had modeled for them in healing the sick. One of the wonderfully named Roman emperors, Julian the Apostate, once complained in a letter that the pagan priests were fleeing town, but that the Christians were staying and serving the poor and dying. Church has been sometimes called a hospital for souls, where the confused nightlifes of this world find a community to follow them through the woods where they wander, lost and afraid. For the lost sheep of this world, we are to be a community of healing. The church is also a community of learning. Did you notice what Jesus did when he saw that they were like sheep without a shepherd? The first thing he did was to teach them. So the church is not only a hospital for souls, it's a school as well. When we find the lost sheep, we tell them who and where they are, inform them of the identity of the shepherd. Some of you I know that I used to teach at a seminary, and I would tell those students preparing for ministry not to give up their role as teachers. We teach one another who God is, what the world is, who we are as a community, what God is calling us to do. And this teaching is the work of a lifetime. And particularly in the context of the church, we become a school of charity. At a time where it seems that hate is the operative stance toward the other, we learn and teach how to love each other, as hard as that is sometimes. And finally, we're a community of worship. We are called to transcendence. We are called each week into the Holy of Holies. We are called to tear aside the veil, to step through the thin places into the very presence of God. We are called to experience the mystery of God in Scripture, in Eucharist, and in each other. The lost sheep of our society need to experience the very presence and power of God, the Good Shepherd. Like nightlife's lost sheep, they need to find their way back to the shepherd. In other words, what this battered and struggling and confused and wandering world needs is for the church to be the church. To be a community of trust and hope, a community of healing, a community of learning and a school of charity, and a community of awe and wonder in the presence of God. This is who we are. This is who we're called to be. Thanks be to God.